All right, welcome back to the channel. So, man, I'm telling you, Jake Paul must be a much bigger superstar than I'm aware of because TYRON Woodley has come out and said that the pay-per-view numbers for that fight between the two of them could be the 5th highest of all time. Let's talk about that in this video. All right, welcome back to the channel. So as we know that there is a fight that took place last weekend between Jake Paul and TYRON Woodley. It was I think it was a well-received fight. It's not an actually true boxing event, but still, well-received fight where I think a lot of casual fans probably got a lot of enjoyment off of it. It's one of these fights along the trends of the Floyd Mayweather Jr. Conor McGregor fight, Floyd Mayweather Jr. versus Techin, right? Those type of fights where it's not an elite boxer, but a personality that is out there fighting another personality. So kind of like a celebrity boxing match. But the popularity, according to TYRON Woodley, who participated in that event, at least he's trying to lead us to believe, or the people are leading him to believe, that this fight was so huge that it was going to wind up being the 5th biggest pay-per-view of all time. And I'm telling you, if that is the case, then boxing is in some absolute trouble, because that is something that it's 100% pure, entertainment. However, if you put it into context, I doubt very much that that's the actual case. Just even in the feel of the fights, right? And the fights that have been taking place recently, I did not get the feel out of that fight that fight was necessarily a bigger fight than Canelo Alvarez versus Gennady Golovkin 1, Canelo Alvarez versus Gennady Golovkin 2. And in fact, I mean, in order to make it to be the 5th biggest pay-per-view of all time, you really do gotta make that fight be a bigger fight. Believe that fight was a bigger fight than Sugar Ray Leonard versus versus Hagler, right? Now, those fights back in the 70s weren't on, in the 80s weren't on something that was called pay-per-view, but it was called closed circuit TV. So, there's fewer people that could have bought it, but just the verbiage around it makes it sound like Jake Paul's fight was one of the biggest fights in history. And I'm just having a really hard time believing that's true, and just thinking that, at a certain point in time, man, people got to put the brakes on the hype. And now I do believe that there has been other instances where the fight really was that big, like a Conor McGregor versus Floyd Mayweather Jr. That wound up being a very, very huge fight. You got a feeling that it was a huge fight, but even in that, people were exaggerating the pay-per-views and saying, that it did like 6 million pay-per-views. And Steven Espinoza, who was the president of Showtime Sports, had to come out and say, no, Dana White, we did not sell that many. We can't, we're a publicly traded, organization. We can't lie about our pay-per-view numbers. So, all of this obfuscation and this, big grandiose claims related to a lot of stuff in boxing, I think is just, it's just exaggeration, and it's a way to make the headlines for the day, which is cool because, hey man, we need things to talk about in boxing, because unfortunately, while the Jake Paul fight, I don't believe, was the 5th biggest fighter ever. And I mean, and it's to the point where I didn't even want to research. I'm not going to research the numbers on that, because it's just an insult to some of the biggest fights around, like Mike Tyson versus Lennox Lewis. Mike Tyson, like if you think of them being the 5th, that means they have to be bigger fight than Mike Tyson versus Lennox Lewis, Mike Tyson versus Evander Holyfield 1 and 2. Right, Oscar De La Hoya, Felix Trinidad, Canelo Alvarez versus Gennady Golovkin, Floyd Mayweather Jr. versus Oscar De La Hoya. You know what I mean? Quite honestly, the list of big pay-per-views in boxing, there's a good number of them, and enough to where you just off the feel of the fight can tell, man, come on, man, you're doing a disservice. Like, you're really doing. Now that's when I think you're starting to do a disservice to boxing, when you just out there lying about how big you are and about how successful the events are, and the event really isn't a boxing match. Right now, I know that there's been big exhibitions before, and I know the fight is big, but still, it's not that big, and to give the idea that it is that big is just, it's just a bunch of malarkey. But going forward for the sport of boxing, I do think that it says something, because it probably is a bigger fight than, say, the Errol Spence Jr., than the Yordenis Ugas Manny Pacquiao fight was, with 250,000. I think they said it did about 250,000 pay-per-views. There is a chance that Jake Paul fight with TYRON Woodley was bigger than that. So I don't want to discount the fact that the fight was big, and that this is a trend that is, that is bringing a lot of attention to, to the sport of boxing, right? Or to the practice of boxing. I don't know how much it's trickling down to other fighters who are not, necessarily in that boxing ring. But I guess, with Jake Paul, with as exciting as it is, I guess I can do a degree of hoping and say, man, I really hope that this turns out for boxing how Jake Paul says it, which is that, people will be attracted to him. There'll be other really good boxing matches on the card, so then other people will get more, casual people will get attracted to boxing. I don't know. I hope so, but what I think I see is just, and especially from the comments that I see around Jake Paul, is that this is, in the videos that people do about it, is that really that is just a really large group of casual fans who really do not watch boxing outside of, the big celebrity things. So, it's not something where these guys are going to pick up boxing and all of a sudden, because they're into a celebrity match with Jake Paul, that they're going to start watching Gary Russell Jr. fights and calling for Gary Russell Jr. to get a fight with Kid Galahad, right? It's just, we are really, really hardcore boxing fans, and I think that it takes time, and it takes, a special fighter that really competes through the ranks to get and draw people into boxing, right? Now, say if Jake Paul was somebody that was really fighting legitimate fighters, and and beating legitimate fighters and coming up the ranks, then I would say, yeah, man, he probably is somebody that can bring people into watching real boxing, because then they would be paying attention to the opponents of Jake Paul, and and when he's going to get a championship shot and all that. Right now, it's just Jake Paul for the sake of Jake Paul, or Logan Paul for the sake of Logan Paul, right? Or to see, what they'll do against an aged fighter like Floyd Mayweather Jr. or MMA fighter. But, I don't want to hate on the entire event and, what's going on with that. But, at the same time, being a really, somebody that is very much into boxing, I do like for, compare apples with apples and not apples with oranges. Because comparing the pay-per-views for this type, and saying that they sold that many, that's hype in and of itself. Just more hype, and it's disrespectful hype to say that boxing is only 5 times in history been as popular as that Jake Paul fight, which I think any reasonable person would know is not true. But anyway, that's my take on the matter. You let me know what you think in the comment section. And with that, I'm out. Peace.